What would you do if the HOA demanded your dock before you even finished unpacking? I had barely moved in when the HOA showed up demanding the dock I'd just finished painting. What they didn't know was, I'm the Waterway Supervisor for this whole lake. From the bogus fines to their staged meeting, it was clear. They wanted to take it. But then I found one document, and the entire HOA began to fall apart. Jake Remy rolled his pickup to a quiet stop at the edge of his new driveway, the tires crunching over gravel that hadn't yet learned the weight of his truck. The late afternoon Montana sun spread gold over Pine Ridge Lake, turning the water into a sheet of moving glass. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and cold shoreline stone, brushing past the open door of the truck as Jake stepped out. Moving boxes filled the yard like half-finished thoughts, chairs leaning against fence posts, a cooler sitting beside an unplugged lamp, and a stack of folded tarps waiting for a place to call home. It was messy, but it was his mess, his land, his future. He stretched his back, feeling that familiar ache from 30 years spent around reservoirs, dams, and water stations. The kind of ache he liked, an honest one. He scanned the lake, following the narrow peninsula where his property jutted into the water like a finger pointing at the distant mountains. And there it was, the dock. 30 feet of weathered pine reaching into stillness, catching the sun in long stripes of silver and blue. A dock he had dreamed about during long nights in the county office, filing water use reports while wishing for something simpler. He grabbed a box labeled kitchen and carried it toward the front porch. The wood groaned under his boots, older than it looked, but solid. He liked that. Things didn't need to be new to be dependable. He'd spent his whole career teaching younger technicians that lesson. He had set the box down only minutes when he heard the agitation of shoes scraping over gravel. Not the kind of steps that approached with curiosity or courtesy. These were purposeful, clipped, marching steps. Jake looked up. A woman in her mid-50s, tall with a stiff pink cardigan and perfectly styled blonde hair, strode down his driveway as if it belonged to her. In one hand, she carried a clipboard stacked with papers. In the other, a folder so bright yellow it seemed designed to catch attention from a mile away. "Good afternoon," she called out, her voice carrying a tone that tried to sound welcoming, but came out like a command. "You must be Mr. Remy." Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "That's right. Can I help you?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him, over his shoulder toward the dock, as if she were inspecting inventory she already owned. Her lips tightened slightly, satisfied with something only she could see. "I'm Bethany Whitfield," she announced, "president of the Willow Ridge Shores Homeowners Association." Jake forced a polite smile, though the introduction alone dropped his stomach a few inches. HOA presidents had a look about them, a way of seeing the world in bullet points and bylaws. He had hoped this community wouldn't be that kind. But hope was free, and often wrong. Before he could offer a handshake, she cleared her throat and lifted one of the papers from her clipboard. Single line was highlighted in neon yellow, the ink bleeding through the thin page. "I'm here regarding the community dock," she said crisply. Jake blinked. "Community dock?" "Yes," she replied, already annoyed that he hadn't understood. "All shoreline structures are considered shared community amenities under our HOA guidelines. That includes the dock behind your home." She extended the highlighted sheet toward him, like it was an eviction notice. "You'll need to sign acknowledgement of HOA authority before any modifications or private use." Jake took the paper but didn't look down yet. He kept his eyes on Bethany's face. There was no uncertainty in her expression, no hesitation. She truly believed what she was saying. That part surprised him more than the claim itself. He finally glanced at the line she'd highlighted. It was vague, intentionally so. Something about waterfront structures supporting community recreation. The kind of sentence written by someone who wanted it interpreted whichever way benefited them most. He folded the paper once, slowly. "Ma'am," he said gently, "that dock is on my deeded land." Bethany gave a quick, tight laugh. "Oh, Mr. Remy, property lines are funny things. Sometimes buyers misunderstand them." Jake felt something spark in his chest. Not anger exactly, but the first warm flicker of it. He had dealt with developers who tried similar tricks, contractors who penciled in imaginary borders on maps, and homeowners who built fences 3 feet past where they belonged. But never, never, someone who walked onto a man's land before he finished unpacking and declared ownership over a dock they'd never hammered a single nail into. Still, he kept his voice even. The dock came with the house, clear as day on the deed and on the county map. Bethany's smile didn't waver, but her eyes cooled. "Our next HOA meeting is Wednesday at 7. We expect your cooperation." She tucked the yellow folder under her arm with the air of someone closing a case. "Welcome to the community." Her heels clicked back up the driveway, kicking dust as she disappeared between 2 tall evergreens. Jake stood there for a long moment, holding the paper she left behind. The breeze ruffled the edges. The lake shimmered quietly, indifferent to the exchange. Somewhere behind him, a loose porch board creaked as the house settled into its new owner. He looked back at the dock, the one they claimed wasn't his, and felt the familiar sting from younger years, when people mistook his calm for weakness, his silence for surrender. He had learned long ago that the loudest person in a room was rarely the strongest. He folded the paper, slipped it into his back pocket, and breathed. Why did she think she could take a dock clearly built on his deeded land? The question followed him like a shadow as the light began to fade over Pine Ridge Lake. Jake spent the rest of that first evening doing the small, necessary things, stacking boxes in corners, plugging in lamps, clearing a path from the front door to the kitchen so he wouldn't break his neck in the dark. But his eyes kept drifting toward the back windows, to where the dock reached into the water like a quiet promise. By the time the last streaks of orange left the sky, he stepped out onto the back porch. The boards creaked under his boots, dry and familiar. Beyond the narrow strip of yard, the dock waited, silvered by moonlight. He walked down to it slowly, hands in his pockets, boots whispering over the weathered planks. The lake breathed around him, tiny ripples catching starlight. He stopped at the end of the dock and looked back toward the house, the porch light casting a soft circle over the grass, his pickup parked at a crooked angle in the gravel. It was all new, unfinished, a little rough around the edges. But beneath the scattered boxes and scuffed boards lay hard lines, survey lines, etched in county records, signed and stamped and filed. He trusted those more than any highlighted HOA printout. "This dock is on my land," he murmured into the cool air, more to himself than to anyone else. The lake didn't argue. He slept like a man who'd spent months packing and driving, but he woke early, body clock still tuned to years of dawn inspections and reservoir checks. Morning light slid across the ceiling. Outside, fog clung low over the water, drifting like slow breath between the trees. He brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to stand up on its own, poured it into a chipped enamel mug, and stepped back outside. Dew soaked through the toes of his boots as he crossed the yard. The peninsula felt different at that hour. Empty, but not lonely, the kind of quiet that invited you to listen. He made a list in his head as he walked. Tighten porch railings, clear brush near the shoreline, eventually repaint the house. And, when time and money allowed, sand and seal the dock so it would last another 30 years. No rush. He had imagined this slow work, this private routine, for years. It lasted less than 48 hours. On the second morning, he opened the front door to a crisp chill and the smell of wet earth. The sun was just clearing the far ridge, turning the long wooden gate at the end of his drive into a dark silhouette against bright sky. Something white fluttered on one of the posts. He frowned and walked down the gravel. As he got closer, he saw it clearly. A standard-size envelope, wedged between two boards, HOA letterhead peeking out in dark green ink. The seal wasn't licked, just tucked. He pulled it free and turned it over. His name, Mr. Jacob Remy, was written in a hand so perfect it looked printed. His stomach tightened. He opened it. Violation notice, the top line declared in bold. Below, in smaller type, grass height exceeds community standard of 2 inches. Measured average approximately 2.5 inches. Fine due $25,000. Corrective action required within 48 hours to avoid further penalties. Jake stood there in the gravel, envelope in one hand, paper in the other, wind tugging at the corners. He glanced down at the strip of yard inside the fence. The grass barely brushed the tops of his boots. In his mind, he saw the dams he'd inspected, the massive walls holding back millions of gallons of water, and something about measuring blades of grass in half-inch increments felt absurd enough to laugh at. He didn't laugh. He folded the notice once, then again, and slid it into the same back pocket as Bethany's highlighted regulation. 2 pieces of paper, neither carrying the weight of a signed deed, yet somehow loud enough to knock on his gate. "Fine," he muttered. "Grass it is." That afternoon, he bought a mower from the hardware store in town. The clerk, a man with gray stubble and the calm eyes of someone who'd watched the town change for decades, nodded when Jake mentioned Willow Ridge Shores. "HOA up there?" the man asked. "Yeah," Jake said. "Seems like it." The clerk just grunted and rang him up. Jake spent the rest of the day mowing his patch of peninsula until the grass was shorter than he'd ever bother with on his own. The mower hummed, the air filled with the sweet, green scent of fresh cuttings. When he finished, the yard looked tidy, almost military. He felt no satisfaction in it. The effort wasn't for him. The next morning, there was another envelope on the fence post. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to it, tore it open, and read while the paper was still flapping in his hand. Violation notice. Mailbox color not in approved community palette. Current, black. Approved, forest green, navy blue, burgundy. Fine, $50,000. Compliance required within 7 days. Jake looked past the paper at the mailbox in question. It was black, metal, simple. The kind you saw in 1,000 small towns, leaning slightly on a weathered post. The flag squeaked when you raised it. It did its job. He felt his jaw clench, not because of the color, but because of the timing. Grass one day, mailbox the next. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. Someone had decided to go down a list. On the 3rd day, the envelope was waiting again, tucked neatly into the same crack between boards, like a daily subscription to resentment. He opened it on the walk back to the house. Violation notice. Trash containers left visible from roadway, past allowable 30 tall. Minutes after collection. Observed, 9:17 a.m. Scheduled pickup, 8:30 a.m. Fine, $50,000. He flashed back to the previous morning, when he'd been on a work call with the county engineer about a culvert failure upriver. He'd watched the garbage truck pass through the window and told himself he'd grab the cans in a minute. Apparently, someone had been watching too, stopwatch in hand. Jake stopped halfway up the drive and looked around. To his left, a row of lake houses curved along the shoreline, their docks extending like ribs into the water. To his right, the main road dipped behind a stand of pines. Curtains shifted in one of the nearby houses. A figure moved away from a window. He wasn't alone out here, not really. Every action, every misplaced can and slightly tall blade of grass was being observed, recorded, and delivered back to his fence in tidy white envelopes. He carried the third notice inside and laid it beside the others on the kitchen counter. 3 violations in 3 days. Grass, mailbox, trash. All signed by the same hand, Bethany's. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, the house still hollow enough that every shift of his weight echoed. He stared at the papers like they were puzzle pieces, turning them sideways in his mind, fitting them against the past 2 days. If it had just been the one, if a single notice about grass had appeared a week after he moved in, he might have believed it was routine. Somebody doing their job, however petty. But this was a pattern, a rhythm, pressure, applied carefully and relentlessly. He thought of the way Bethany had looked past him to the dock, eyes narrowing just slightly, voice full of certainty when she said, "Community dock." He remembered her laugh when he mentioned the deed, as if ownership was a misunderstanding she'd correct in due time. Jake picked up one of the notices and read it again, slower this time. At the bottom, just above Bethany's looping signature, was a line he hadn't paid much attention to before. Failure to resolve consistent violations may result in legal action, including but not limited to liens or forced compliance. There it was, the goal line. You stack enough small fines, he thought, and you can build any kind of wall you want. He walked to the back door and stepped onto the porch. The lake was calmer than the day before, the surface broken only by a single boat cutting across the far side, leaving a white trail that faded slowly. The dock stretched out in front of him, quiet, steady, indifferent. Jake felt the anger, but it was different now. It wasn't the hot flash from being insulted or inconvenienced. It was something cooler, denser, the kind that settled deep and stayed. He'd spent years dealing with developers who used water like a weapon, diverting streams, choking wetlands, hiding behind permits and fine print. Most of them had worn suits instead of pastel cardigans. But the method here felt familiar. Push a boundary, blame the paperwork, grind your target down until they surrender what's theirs just to make the noise stop. Only this time the target was him, his dock, his land. He watched the sun climb higher over the ridge, burning off the last of the fog. The envelopes on his counter, the bright highlight-ons, Bethany's regulation sheet, the way her heels had kicked up dust on his driveway, it all stacked together into something that no longer felt like coincidence. Someone wasn't just enforcing rules. Someone wanted him to yield. He let the idea sit there in the morning light, weighing it. Who was orchestrating this sudden storm of fines? And why so fast? The question followed him around for the next 24 hours, drifting behind every task he tried to do. Jake worked through his checklist, tightening porch rails, stacking boxes along the living room wall, clearing branches along the path that led to the shoreline. But the sense of being watched lingered like dust hanging in a cabin's afternoon sunbeam. A curtain shifting, a car slowing on the road, the slight whisper of footsteps somewhere behind the pines. By the third morning, he needed fresh air more than he needed answers, so he drove into town to pick up a few things he'd forgotten. Extra screws, a pack of LED bulbs, and a heavier push broom for the dock. The drive was quiet, just the hum of the truck's tires and the distant call of a hawk circling over the ridge. It calmed him, at least for a little while. When he returned, the gravel popped beneath his wheels as he eased into the driveway. The peninsula lay ahead, reaching into the blue water like an arm stretching toward the sun. For a moment, everything seemed exactly as he left it. Then he saw movement. Down at the end of his dock, 3 figures lounged comfortably as if they'd rented the place for the weekend. 2 adults sat in bright fold-out chairs, feet propped on a cooler. Between them, a small folding table held sandwiches, bags of chips, and a half-empty bottle of soda. A Bluetooth speaker thumped out cheerful music that carried over the lake. And farther out, a child swung from the LED lights Jake had installed just days earlier, her sneakers kicking above the water. Jake stepped out of his truck slowly. His boots hit the ground with a muted thud. He took in the scene without saying a word, letting the details settle. The chair legs scraping against his freshly sanded planks. The cooler leaving puddles as the ice melted. The oily fingerprints on the rails he had tightened by hand. He walked a few steps toward the shoreline until his voice could carry without shouting. "Morning," he called out, keeping it level. The man, maybe mid-30s, wearing bright swim trunks, barely turned his head. "Hey, how's it going?" he said, as if greeting a passerby at a campground. Jake tried again. "Can I help you folks with something?" The man finally looked at him, really looked, and then shrugged. "Nope. Bethany said this dock was for everyone. She told us to go ahead and enjoy it any time." Jake blinked. "Bethany?" "Yeah, HOA lady." The man pointed vaguely toward the houses up the road. "She said since it's the community dock, we're welcome to use it. Been waiting years for someone to fix it up. You did a nice job with these lights, by the way." The compliment hit Jake harder than the intrusion. Some part of him wanted to laugh, but the rest of him tightened, jaw, shoulders, breath, as he watched the kid swing from the lights he'd spent a whole evening wiring and testing. The woman looked up from her book, sunglasses sliding down her nose. "Don't you believe in sharing?" she said, in a tone that suggested the answer was already disappointing. Jake let a long breath out, feeling the lake breeze tug gently at his shirt. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, not racing, just steady, heavy. He stepped onto the first board of the dock, but stopped himself from going farther. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation with a child hanging off one of the rails. "This is private property," he said quietly. "I didn't give anyone permission to be here." The man shrugged again, kicked open the lid of the cooler, and pulled out another drink. "Take it up with your HOA president," he said, cracking the can. "She made it clear. This place isn't private." Jake stood there for a long moment, listening to the music thumping against the lake surface. The sound was too bright, too careless for the calm that had drawn him to this place. A gull swept low across the water, startled by the noise. He could have argued, could have raised his voice, could have walked to the end of the dock and demanded they leave. But he'd dealt with these kinds of conflicts before, on job sites, at county hearings, during disputes that started small and spiraled into something far larger because someone let emotion lead the conversation. So he didn't shout. He didn't lecture. Instead, he turned around and walked back toward the house, each step heavier than the last, the wooden planks moaning under his boots as though sharing his irritation. He didn't stop until he reached the porch, leaning on the railing and watching them from a distance, not as an enemy, but as evidence. Bethany wasn't just enforcing rules. She wasn't just sending fines. She was reshaping reality for everyone else, telling them what she wanted them to believe. And the neighbors believed it. The picnic lasted nearly an hour. The family packed up slowly, leaving the chip bags stuffed loosely into the cooler, but forgetting a few wrappers that skittered across the dock in the breeze. One of the LED bulbs dangled at an odd angle, knocked loose by the child's play. Jake waited until they walked up the road, laughing casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. He walked down to the dock and crouched beside the loose light. The screw threads were stripped. He'd have to replace it. He picked up a crumpled wrapper, turned it over in his fingers, then tucked it into his pocket with the same quiet restraint he'd used with the violation notices pinned to his gate. But the feeling was different now. The irritation from before had sharpened into something cold and precise, like the edge of a tool he'd used too many times to count. He knew patterns. He knew pressure. He knew when someone was testing boundaries to see what they could get away with. He looked out over the lake, the mountains reflecting upside down in the water. A faint ripple passed under the dock as if the lake itself was shifting in its sleep. Quietly, without saying a word, he whispered something only the wind could hear. "That's enough." He stood up, brushing dust from his hands. In the distance, a curtain moved again. Another window closed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. He walked toward the house with a slow, deliberate calm. If strangers felt free to walk onto his dock today, what would they dare tomorrow? But justice has a way of unsettling the dust before it settles things down. And by late afternoon, the whole neighborhood felt like a shaken snow globe. Flakes of rumor, accusation, and panic swirling through every porch, driveway, and whispering pine. Jake heard it first in fragments, voices rising and falling across the cul-de-sac like uneven wind gusts. "Did you see the sheriff's face?" Bethany didn't know. Did she? Marcus has been pushing for lake access for years. Illegal beach? What does that even mean? The words drifted across the water, carried by the soft lap of waves against the pilings. Jake sat on his front steps, sipping lukewarm coffee, feeling the calm silence that always followed a well-placed truth. But he also knew this wasn't the end. Not even close. By 6 o'clock, the community center parking lot filled again. This time not with balloons and picnic baskets, but with tight-lipped residents, crossed arms, hushed arguments, and the uneasy realization that the foundation of their HOA might not have been built on rules and order, but on sand. Jake didn't plan to go, but then he saw Sarah Coleman's dusty Subaru pull up to his driveway. She climbed out, a stack of binders tucked under one arm. A practiced calm sat on her face, the kind lawyers wear when they know they're walking into a storm, but have already checked the weather report. "You ready?" she asked. Jake stood, brushed dust off his jeans. "For what?" Sarah tilted her head toward the noise echoing from the community center. "The unraveling." They walked together, gravel crunching underfoot. The center's windows glowed warm, silhouettes pacing inside like restless shadows. The moment Jake stepped through the door, conversations collided into silence. People turned, some embarrassed, some relieved, some angry, not at him, but at the people who'd dragged them into chaos. Bethany stood near the podium, clutching papers that trembled in her hands. She looked pale, almost gray around the edges, makeup faded from stress. When she saw Jake, her shoulders sank, not in resentment, but in something closer to dread. "Mr. Remy," she began softly, we need to talk." Sarah stepped forward. "Let's start with what the county confirmed this morning." She placed a binder on the table with a soft thud. The sound carried through the room like a judge striking a gavel. Inside were certified copies of the hydrology agreement, the 15-foot buffer, and the illegal encroachments. Sarah flipped pages slowly, letting neighbors see the county stamps, the signatures, the decades-old print. Murmurs rippled through the room again, this time layered with disbelief. Bethany swallowed hard. "I didn't know, I swear. I didn't know any of this." Jake believed her. He'd seen enough people in his career to recognize genuine shock from crafted innocence. Bethany looked like someone who'd finally realized she'd been standing in the wrong spotlight the entire time. But then Marcus Reed stepped forward. His shirt was crisp, his hair was neatly combed. But his eyes were frantic, darting, searching for any foothold in a room that no longer supported him. "This has been misinterpreted," he insisted, waving a folded plan in the air. "The original development documents were clear." Sarah cut him off with a raised brow. "The ones filed under an LLC dissolved in 2012, those documents." Marcus's jaw clenched. She continued, "The county verified that your firm, Well, your former firm filed at least 4 easements with no legal authority. You tried to establish a pathway to justify seizing Mr. Remy's dock as community access. That's not misinterpretation, Marcus. The room tightened around him like a noose. Bethany spoke next, her voice cracking. Marcus, did you know about the buffer zone? The beach being illegal? Did you hide this from me? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence did it for him. Neighbors who had once defended him now took a step back. People murmured. A woman whispered, I knew it. I always knew something was off. Jake simply watched. Calm. Measured. Present. He didn't need to say a thing. Sarah continued, turning another page. We also discovered that the surveyors who placed stakes in Mr. Remy's water were sent by a subcontractor Marcus hired, without permits, without HOA approval, without notifying the county. Bethany gasped, covering her mouth. Marcus's knuckles turned white around his briefcase handle. Someone in the crowd finally erupted. You put us at risk for fines, for lawsuits. Another added, my kids swim on that beach. You built it on county land? The noise rose until Bethany shouted, Enough! Silence fell. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then spoke toward Jake. Not at him, but toward him, like someone acknowledging the truth for the first time. I'm sorry, she whispered. You were right. And I didn't want to see it. Jake nodded once. No gloating. No smirk. Just acknowledgement. But the moment hung heavy. The damage wasn't just legal. It was personal. A whole community had been misled. Bethany turned toward the crowd. We will comply with the county orders. We will remove structures from the buffer. And we will take responsibility for our mistakes. Marcus stiffened. This isn't over, he muttered. Sarah answered calmly. For you, it's just beginning. He stormed out of the building, the door slamming so hard the window panes rattled. The sound echoed through the hall like a bell tolling the end of something rotten. Inside, the tension eased, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of accountability. Neighbors approached Jake one by one. Some apologized. Some thanked him. Some simply nodded, humbled. For the first time since he moved in, Jake felt something shift in the air. An old community was breaking. A new one was being formed. But deep down, beneath the murmurs and the cleanup of scattered papers, he knew one thing. Marcus wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The Montana night settled in with a heavy stillness, the kind that made trees stand stiff and shadows cling to the earth. Jake sat on his back porch, boots propped on the railing, listening to the soft hiss of the lake. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful, like the worst had passed. But the quiet had an edge to it, a sharpness under the surface. Storms didn't always come with thunder. Sometimes they came with silence. By midnight, the wind picked up. Branches twisted overhead. Clouds drifted across the moon, thinning the light until the yard looked like an old photograph. Jake finished his coffee and stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. That was when he heard it. A sound out of place. A harsh, mechanical snarl ripping through the stillness. A chainsaw. Jake froze, every muscle going tight. Not a distant chainsaw from a rancher clearing fallen limbs. Not the tidy buzz of weekend yard work. This was frantic, uncontrolled, almost panicked. He stepped off the porch and followed the noise down the gravel path, boots crunching softly. The hum rose and fell in strained bursts, echoing across the cul-de-sac. As he rounded the bend, the source came into view. Marcus Reed, still in pajama bottoms and work boots, stood beneath a stand of mature oak trees along the HOA common boundary, chainsaw roaring in his hands. Wood chips flew in wild arcs. One tree was already leaning at an unnatural angle, its trunk cut halfway through. Jake stopped a good distance away, watching. Marcus didn't see him at first. He looked deranged, not in a violent way, but in a frantic, unraveling one. His jaw clenched, his face taut with sweat and fury. Every motion was jerky, desperate. It wasn't anger driving him anymore. It was collapse. Jake stepped closer, voice even. "Marcus!" The chainsaw jerked as Marcus whirled around, eyes wide, teeth gritted. "You!" he shouted over the roar. "You did this! You ruined everything!" Jake kept his hands at his sides. "Put the saw down. You're going to hurt yourself." Marcus snarled, spittle catching the moonlight. "You think you're a hero? Think exposing a few documents makes you righteous?" He jabbed the chainsaw toward the trees. "You have no idea what you've started. If I go down, the whole HOA goes with me." "You're destroying common property," Jake said quietly. "This isn't a solution. It's sabotage." Marcus barked an ugly laugh, the chainsaw humming impatiently at his hip. "There is no solution. You dragged the county into this. You humiliated Bethany. You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself," Jake interrupted. "You forged documents, trespassed, filed illegal easements. This is the result of your actions, not mine." Marcus's voice cracked, a thin, brittle sound. "You don't understand what I've lost." The wind whistled through the leaning oak, the tree creaking like an old door. Jake took half a step back. "Marcus, walk away. Right, now. Before someone calls." Blue lights splashed across the trees. A sheriff's SUV rolled into view. Deputies stepped out, hands steady, posture calm but authoritative. One shouted, "Marcus, turn off the saw." Marcus whipped around to face them, breathing hard. "You think I care? Huh? You think any of this matters now?" The chainsaw sputtered as he swung it toward another trunk, but his hands were trembling too badly. The blade nicked the bark, throwing out a spray of splinters. Jake didn't move, didn't speak. He watched the moment unfold like fragile glass cracking. A deputy approached slowly. "Marcus, drop the saw. This isn't the way." Marcus's shoulders sagged, the fight bleeding out of him. The chainsaw fell from his grip, hitting the dirt with a dull thud before coughing to silence. As deputies cuffed him, gently, carefully, Marcus didn't resist, didn't glare, didn't spit. He simply looked, empty. A hollow man who'd been propped up by power he never deserved. As they guided him toward the SUV, he turned his head just enough to see Jake, and in a hoarse whisper roughened by defeat, he spoke the final words he would ever direct at him. "You destroyed my life over a stupid dock." Jake met his eyes, steady as bedrock. "You destroyed your own life," he said. "I just refused to let you destroy mine." Marcus swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. For a moment, something almost like understanding flickered in his expression. Then the door shut, sealing him inside with a soft, metallic click. The deputies finished gathering statements. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the lights and noise. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. Some watched in somber silence as the SUV pulled away down the lane. Jake stood under the rustling oak branches, hands in his pockets, listening to the chainsaw's echo fade into the night. He didn't feel triumph or vindication, just a quiet, heavy realization. The man who'd tried to take everything from him had instead lost everything himself. By the time the last deputy drove off, the air had stilled again. The moon drifted free of the clouds, lighting the lake in a pale glow. Jake walked back home alone, the gravel crunch steady under his boots. When he reached his porch, he paused, looking out over the dark water. The fight wasn't completely over. But the worst of it had finally broken, like a fever burning itself out. And tomorrow, the community would wake to a new truth. The bully who had ruled their HOA for years was gone. Dawn came soft and clean over the lake, brushing the ripples with pale pink light. Jake stood at the edge of his dock, coffee warming his hands, boots planted on the boards he had sanded, painted, protected, and nearly lost. The quiet felt earned, like land settling after a long storm. The neighborhood moved slowly that morning. People stepped outside not to glare or complain or measure grass, but to breathe. A sense of relief lingered in the air, mixed with curiosity about what came next. Jake didn't have to wait long. Ernest Walker, the old rancher who'd stayed silent through most of the chaos, walked up Jake's gravel path with the deliberate, steady gait of a man who'd seen plenty of hard years and even harder people. "Morning, son," Ernest said, tipping his hat. "Heard you slept through the night for once." Jake chuckled, sipping his coffee. "Didn't think peace was possible around here." "It wasn't," Ernest replied. "Not with Marcus running things like his own kingdom. But that's done. Folks voted early this morning, asked me to serve as interim HOA president, and I said yes." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want that burden?" Ernest shrugged. "Some burdens are worth carrying, especially when the last fella carried it straight into the mud." They both laughed quietly, the lake echoing the sound. Ernest's features softened as he looked out over the water. "You did right, Jake. Not just for yourself, for everyone." Jake nodded, letting the words settle in the cool air. "Just wanted to protect what was mine." "That's the thing," Ernest said. "You didn't just protect your dock. You gave this community a chance to start over." He handed Jake a folded piece of paper. Jake opened it, scanning the contents. An official HOA announcement. Dock redesignated as private property. HOA structures removed from county buffer. New transparency bylaws enacted. Independent attorney required for all future land decisions. Jake folded the letter carefully. "That's a good start." "A fresh start," Ernest corrected. "And we'll keep it that way." Later that afternoon, a soft knock sounded on Jake's front door. Bethany Whitfield stood outside, dressed plainly, eyes red-rimmed but clear. No blazer, no clipboard, no authority in her posture, only remorse. "Jake, may I?" she began. He stepped aside. "Come in." She clutched her hands together, twisting a napkin she must have brought for nerves more than anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I let pride and fear guide me. Marcus, he fed those fears, told me you were dangerous, that you'd ruin everything. And you believed him," Jake said gently. "I did." Bethany nodded, tears gathering. "And it cost all of us. I stepped down this morning. Ernest is right for the job. I never was." Jake offered her a seat. "You weren't the enemy, Bethany. You were misled." She shook her head slowly. "Doesn't excuse what I did, but I want to make it right. If you'll let me." He gave a slow nod. "Then start by helping Ernest clean up the mess. Make sure this never happens again." A relieved smile broke through her tears. "I will." When she left, the afternoon wind picked up, tossing pine needles across the path like nature resetting its own order. By evening, kids were playing in their yards again. Neighbors introduced themselves properly this time, not with accusations or complaints, but with cautious, hopeful conversation. Jake received more apologies than he expected. He didn't hold grudges. Not anymore. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the lake in amber and gold, Jake returned to his dock, coffee replaced with a cold beer. He sat on the edge, toes skimming the last warmth of the day's water. He thought of Marcus, his rage, his downfall, his whispered blame. A man undone by his own lies. He thought of Bethany, her fear disguised as control now melting into humility. He thought of Ernest, steady, honest, the kind of leader a place like this needed. And he thought of himself, how he arrived wanting peace, only to be met with a fight he never asked for. Yet here he was, still standing, still calm, still home. A loon called from across the water, the sound echoing deep and low. Jake smiled, letting the moment sink into him. He murmured, almost to the lake itself, "When you know what's yours, you stop asking permission to protect it." The wind carried the words out over the water, scattering them like seeds. Later, as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, a pair of headlights rolled down the road. A young family stepped out of a car in the driveway of the foreclosed house next door. Fresh faces, new beginnings. They waved. Jake waved back. Life was moving forward. The lake was quiet again, and his dock, his sanctuary, stood strong beneath the fading light, remembering the man who fought for it and refused to bow. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about honoring what's rightfully yours. If you'd have defended that dock too, go ahead and type yes in the comments. And if this story hit home or reminded you of your own run-ins with an HOA, drop a quick justice below. Stick around and subscribe if you'd like to hear more real heart, real land, real justice stories from the ranch side of life.